Welcome back to Sociology 227. This is Sara Ahmed, video 2. In this video, I've got 3 jobs. The first is to explore the argument in Queer Phenomenology, Ahmed's book that contains some of the piece you read today. Next, I want to explore Ahmed's Phenomenology of Whiteness and give you some examples. Finally, I'll get you ready to do your 2-paragraph response. Let's do it. Queer Phenomenology came out in 2006, and I think it brings together the themes we've been addressing very well in 226 and 227. In Queer Phenomenology, Ahmed takes phenomenology to task for its failure to embrace different ways of being attuned to the world. She wants to fix that. In the classic phenomenology literature, the point is to get to the basis of human life despite the different ways that we live in it. We look past immanent things to get to the transcendent. We bracket the things about our particular ways of acting in the world and move to the conditions of our existence. Here, Ahmed, like Iris Marion Young, would object to such a formulation. To assume that there is a shared world and a shared form of having a body in that world sounds nice and egalitarian, but as we saw in the past video, it has consequences. This friendly way of looking at the world fails to account for difference, in terms of the differing forms of power and authority that stratify us, and the different ways that we choose to orient ourselves to the world. Here, Iris Marion Young appeals to women's situation. Instead of addressing all people, she looks to a particular few. Now, Sara Ahmed has read her Foucault and her Judith Butler, and sees, like Butler, that this approach isn't enough. We can't just single women out. Gender, sexual orientation, and race all matter, and these ways of existing don't each demand attention individually. We need to do them all at once. So, then, she moves away from a particular subject to the institutional distribution of subjectivities, how some bodies are made to matter more than others. Throughout Queer Phenomenology, Ahmed returns to questions of intersectionality and lines, in the way that institutional and theoretical exclusions are themselves the problem to be addressed. When she is queering phenomenology, Ahmed is asking about its founding orientations, and how, if we took some divergences, through things like gender and the constitution of intersectional oppression, into consideration, what that project might look like. So to queer phenomenology is not just to ask what the experience of being queer is, it is to ask about the different kinds of experiences that don't get considered in the phenomenological tradition. This means going back to the founders, like Husserl. Ahmed uses the example of the founder of phenomenology, Husserl, and the table at which he wrote his many books. She uses it as an explanation for the basic ground from which phenomenological exploration takes place. In the book, she thinks about the table as a gendered site. To do phenomenology at the table, to surpass its material reality, someone has to clean it. It has to be cleared. She asks then about the gendered work that needs to take place in Husserl's house before he can sit down and write. The table is the 0 point of Husserl's orientation, where his philosophy begins from. Queering phenomenology means, in part, asking about the socially organized nature of basic origins. Someone needs to do housework before phenomenology can take place. So, and to repeat, we can see that in asking about the basis of starting points, Ahmed is trying to take seriously the hierarchy of gendered labor. So, she's trying to address the thematic dimension of Karl Marx and Dorothy Smith's work, focusing on material conditions. There's a lot of work to be done before supposedly presuppositionless philosophy begins. Here we can think about the background that Husserl argued we all share in everyday common life. When we abstract from the social and material practices that make phenomenological philosophy, or indeed any other way of thinking possible, we are engaging in a political act. This is the same form of political act that Butler addresses in terms of the sex-gender dichotomy. So in queering phenomenology, Ahmed is asking sociological questions about power, authority, and inequality. This is how she explores whiteness. In her Phenomenology of Whiteness, Ahmed brings forth some material that I've talked about in the past video, on embodiment and so-called incorporation. For Merleau-Ponty and for Iris Marion Young, we begin to incorporate particular habits into our intentional arc. Consider the example of my cane, which I used to walk, becoming a habitual entity through which the world is made available. My cane makes my world bigger. Or consider the example of walking in high heels. There is a learned bodying forth into the world that comes with their use. We break in a new pair of shoes, but those shoes also become incorporated into our intentional arc. Ahmed is going to argue that individuals use tools, yes, but also institutions become habituated to particular types of bodies. We move from the individual to the institutional. Ahmed is arguing that bodily tendencies are installed and reproduced at the institutional level. Yes, they do refer to particular bodies, but this isn't all. Moments, rather than those who encounter them, are her object. Here she is able to address both Foucauldian questions about history and meaningful questions about how we experience that history. Or at least she would argue. In doing so, she subjects institutions to an analysis of orientation. She asks, how do bodies marked as white pass through particular institutions, and how do those same institutions treat others? While those in the existential tradition are looking to particular individual lives and how we live in them, Ahmed wants to argue that institutions themselves promote particular lines, particular color lines, in the kinds of bodies that are and have been made welcome, and the kinds that are not. As an example, think about ubiquitous whiteness at Queen's. What kind of bodies have historically been welcome to the university? And how do those structures reproduce particular bodily orientations? In this sense, Ahmed's is a positive phenomenology of whiteness. Not because whiteness is good, but because it is a modality of belonging reproduced institutionally. How do institutions make some bodies fit and exclude others? What forms of belonging are attributed to particular cultures in which other ones are assumed to be the default, the usual, the ordinary? In these ways, Ahmed is exploring the structures of belonging, rather than the abstract structures of consciousness or existence. Phenomenology helps us to show how race is an effect of racialization, and to affect how the invention of race, as if it were in bodies, shapes what bodies can do. Page 112. So the point is to look at an institutional setting and see which bodies pass through unnoticed and which bodies are made to stand out. This manifests both in the questions of, no, where are you really from, to the institutional exercise of whiteness in traffic stops. Ahmed's example of the airport stop in New York, discussed in the readings, and the no-fly list would be perfectly pertinent. Remember that Ahmed is telling us to pay attention to how we meaningfully incorporate exclusion into our lives, rather than simply counting who is and who is not included. Here we can think of the example of carding to talk about this, or the experience of a traffic stop. Does Ahmed think that people of color should be stopped disproportionately in these examples? No, of course not. But she wants to argue that there is an important sociological story in how it feels to be a body out of place, and made out of place, alongside statistical ones. How does one live their life knowing they're more likely to be stopped, or to be followed around the mall by security? What spaces do we avoid or inhabit because of these institutional facts? These are important Sara Ahmed questions. As a second example, think of the reconciliation discourses I discussed in the post-colonialism videos, and the racialized us versus them discourses at work in the Canadian colonial state. We can see the reproduction of whiteness in the discourses over whose land is being impeded, whose bodies and cultures matter in the costs associated with, say, rail blockages, and on whose terms reconciliation is being conducted. Ahmed would read this as a form of orientation to particular types of bodies, cultural institutions, and discourses of belonging. In each of these examples, Ahmed's moving us from the individual level to the institutional level. The phenomenological focus on meaning remains. Next, let's look to diversity discourses to see these same mechanisms at work. In equity, diversity, and inclusion work, Ahmed says, we discuss happy stories of diversity arriving, rather than the sad stories of racism that seem to get put under the rug. Think about affirmative action or equity-focused employers. This is a happy story. More diversity. If you're qualified, we'll let you in. As a favor. Favors are good, they are happy. This is not, I think, the model for Ahmed's phenomenology. In actual terms, I quote, this involves a desire to hear happy stories of diversity, rather than unhappy stories of racism. This gives us pause to question both the importance of diversity as an institutional goal, who benefits from doing work in diversity, and the labor of diversity, who does it fall on? From Ahmed's desk cleaning perspective, we need to ask how diversity work could be treated as real labor like anything else versus something that institutions make themselves do to feel happier, or to look better. Ahmed's work is not a happy story of diversity, it is an unpleasant story of the institutional production of whiteness. Certain bodies are default and other ones are diverse. The goal is not to extend whiteness to others, but to rather inhibit its institutional reproduction. So Ahmed's argument is that equity, diversity, and inclusion policies treat diversity as an individual problem. We need more diverse individuals in the institution. This overshadows sad stories of racism. What are the structures that exclude people from participating in the institution? A queer phenomenology and the phenomenology of whiteness attends to these structural conditions. Let me conclude using a personal example of my most recent trip to Philadelphia. Last reading week, I went to Philly. How is it that I saw the institutional reproduction of whiteness there? Here I will highlight two main forms. The first was the art gallery, as you can see here in this photo of me and my cane on the rocky steps. Well, I think the art gallery is a space where whiteness is reproduced in terms of cultural capital and the kinds of bodies distributed there. The interpreters, all white. The security guards, all people of color. How do people become accustomed to this? And how does one dwell there at work or at leisure, knowing this fact? Secondly, I also stayed in Fishtown, a quickly gentrifying neighborhood. That is, I was gentrifying the neighborhood. The only people of color I saw there were driving delivery vans. How was one made to feel unwelcome in a neighborhood where one was once the majority? This is a Sara Ahmed question. So too is the what does one feel like to know that one is part of gentrification question. However we address this, or don't, broaches the question of meaning and inclusion and standing out. The point is not to ignore the question of oppression, but to show how it relates to the phenomenological emphasis on meaning. Now it's your turn. In 2 paragraphs between 5 to 8 sentences in length, and with reference to the readings, 1. Explain how Sara Ahmed reorients the phenomenological focus on meaning. 2. Show us how she does so using the example of institutionalized whiteness. See you next week.